Chapter 7 of the Vikings by Alan Mawer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kevin Johnson. Chapter 7. The Vikings in Baltic lands and Russia. The activities of the Northmen during the Viking Age were not confined to the lands west and south of their original homes. The Baltic was as familiar to them as the North Sea. To go East Viking was almost as common as to go West Viking, and Scandinavian settlements were founded on the shores of the Baltic and far inland along the great waterways leading into the heart of Russia. As was to be expected from their geographical position, it was the Danes and Swedes rather than Norwegians who were active in Baltic lands, the Danes settling chiefly on the Pomeranian coast among the Wends, while the Swedes occupied lands further east and founded the Scandinavian kingdom of Russia. Already in the early years of the 9th century we find the Danish king Guðröðr now making war against his Slavonic neighbours in Mecklenburg-Schwerin, now intriguing with them against the emperor. Mention is made of more than one town on the southern coast of the Baltic bearing an essentially Scandinavian name, pointing to the existence of extensive settlements. Interesting evidence of this eastward movement is also to be found in the life of St Ansgar. There we learn how, soon after 830, a Danish fleet captured a city in the land of the Slavs with great riches, and we hear in 853 how the Swedes were endeavouring to reconquer Kurland, which had been under their rule, but had now thrown off the yoke and fallen a prey to a fleet of Danish Vikings, possibly the one just mentioned. St Ansgar himself undertook the education of many Wendish youths who had been entrusted to him. This and other evidence prepare us for the establishment in the 10th century of the most characteristic of all Viking settlements, that of Jómsborg on the island of Wollin at the mouth of the Oder. According to tradition, King Gorm the Old conquered a great kingdom in Wendland, but it was to his son Harold Bluetooth that the definite foundation of Jómsborg was ascribed. For many years there had been an important trading centre at Julin on the island of Wollin, where traders from Scandinavia, Saxony, Russia and many other lands met together to take part in the rich trade between north and south, east and west, which passed through Julin, standing as it did on one of the great waterways of Central Europe. Large finds of Byzantine and Arabic coins bear witness to the extensive trade with Greece and the Orient which passed through Julin, while the Silberberg on which Jómsborg once stood is so called from the number of silver coins from Frisia, Lorraine, Bavaria and England which have been found there. It was no doubt in the hope of securing some fuller share in this trade that Harold established the great fortress of Jómsborg and entrusted its defence to a warrior community on whom he imposed the strictest rules of organisation. The story of the founding of Jómsborg is told in the late and untrustworthy Jómsvikingasaga, but, while we must reject many of the details there set forth, it is probable that the rules of the settlement as given there are based on a genuine tradition, and they give us a vivid picture of life in a Viking warrior community. No one under 18 or over 50 years of age was admitted to their fellowship, and neither birth nor friendship, only personal bravery, could qualify a man for admission. No one was allowed to continue a member who uttered words of fear, or who fled before one who was his equal in arms and strength. Every member was bound to avenge a fallen companion as if he were his brother. No women were allowed within the community, and no one was to be absent for more than 3 days without permission. All news was to be told in the first instance to their leader, and all plunder was to be shared at a common stake. The harbour of Jómsborg could shelter a fleet of 300 vessels and was protected by a mole with 12 iron gates. The Jómsvikings played an important if stormy part in the affairs of the three Scandinavian kingdoms in the later years of the 10th and the early 11th century. Many of them came to England in the train of King Svein, while Jarl Thorkel was for a time in the service of Ethelred the Unready. The decline of Jómsborg as a Viking stronghold dates from its devastation by Magnus the Good in 1043, but the importance of Julin as a trading centre continued unimpaired for many years to come. From Jómsborg, Harold Bluetooth's son Hákon made an attack on Samland in the extreme east of Prussia, but the real exploitation of the eastern Baltic fell as was natural to the Swedes rather than to the Danes. We have already mentioned their presence in Kurland on the Gulf of Riga, and we learn from Swedish runic inscriptions of expeditions to Samland, to the Semgali (in Kurland) and to the river Duna. The important fortified port of Seaburg was probably near to Riga, while the chief trade route from the island of Gothland lay round Cape Domesnæs (note the Scandinavian name) to the mouth of the Duna. The chief work of the Swedes was however to be done in lands yet further south, in the heart of the modern empire of Russia in Europe. The story of the founding of the Russian kingdom is preserved to us in the late 10th century chronicle of the monk Nestor, who tells us that in the year 859 Varangians came over the sea and took tribute from various Finnish, Tatar and Slavonic peoples inhabiting the forest regions round Lake Ilmen, between Lake Ladoga and the upper waters of the Dnieper. Again he tells us that in 862 the Varangians were driven over seas and tribute was refused, but soon the tribes quarrelled among themselves, and some suggested that they should find a prince who might rule over them and keep the peace. So they sent across the sea to the Varangians, to the Rus, for such is the name of these Varangians, just as others are called Swedes, Northmen, Anglians, Goths, saying that their land was great and powerful but there was no order within it, and asking them to come and rule over them. 3 brothers with their followers were chosen, the eldest Rurik (Old Norse Hrorikr) settled in Novgorod, the second in Bielozero, the third in Truvor in Izborsk. 3 years later 2 of the brothers died and Rurik took control of the whole of the settlements, dividing the land among his men. In the same year 2 of Rurik's followers, Askold (Old Norse Höskuldr) and Dir (Old Norse Diri), setting out for Constantinople, halted at Kiev and there founded a kingdom, which in 882 was conquered by Rurik's successor Oleg (Old Norse Helgi), and, as the mother of all Russian cities, became the capital of the Russian kingdom. There is a certain naivety about this story which is characteristic of the monkish chronicler generally, and it is clear that, after the usual manner of the annalist who is compiling his record long after the events described, Nestor has grouped together under 1 or 2 dates events which were spread over several years, but the substantial truth of the narrative cannot be impugned and receives abundant confirmation from various sources. The earliest evidence for the presence of these Rus in Eastern Europe is found in the story of the Byzantine embassy to the Emperor Lewis the Pious in 839, when certain people called Rus, who had been on a visit to Constantinople, came in the train of the embassy and asked leave to return home through the empire. Enquiries were made and it was found that these Rus were Swedes. This would point to the presence of Rus in Russia at a date earlier than that given by Nestor, and indeed the rapid extension of their influence indicates a period of activity considerably longer than that allowed by him. These Rus or Rus soon came into relations both of trade and war with the Byzantine Empire. We have preserved to us from the years 911 and 944 commercial treaties made between the Rus and the Greeks, showing that they brought all kinds of furs and also slaves to Constantinople, receiving in exchange various articles of luxury including gold and silver ornaments, silks and other rich stuffs. The names of the signatories of these treaties are, on the side of the Rus, almost entirely of Scandinavian origin and may to some extent be shown to be of definitely Swedish provenance. About the year 950 the Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus, writing a tractate on the administration of the empire, describes how traders from various parts of Russia assemble at Kiev and sail down the Dnieper on their way to Constantinople. Their course down the Dnieper was impeded by a series of rapids, and Constantine gives their names both in Russian and in Slavonic form, and though the names are extremely corrupt in their Greek transcription, there is no mistaking that the Russian names are really forms belonging to some Scandinavian dialect. The Rus were also well known as warriors and raiders. In 865 they sailed down the Dnieper, across the Black Sea and made their way into the Sea of Marmora. Their fleet was dispersed by a storm, but they were more successful in 907 when Oleg with some 2,000 ships harried the environs of Constantinople and was bought off by a heavy tribute. These attacks were continued at intervals during the next century. We also find a good deal of interesting information about these Rus, as they are called, in various Arab historians. We hear how they sailed their vessels down the chief waterways and had such a firm hold on the Black Sea that by the year 900 it was already known as the Russian Sea. Often they dragged their vessels overland from one stream to another, and thus they made their way from the upper waters of the Don down the Volga to the Caspian Sea. But not only do we have a description of their journeyings, we also learn a good deal of their customs and habits. And though at times the information given is open to suspicion, archaeological research tends to confirm the statements of these historians and to show that the civilization of the Rus closely resembled that of the Scandinavian peoples generally in the Viking Age. The identification of the ancient Rus with the Swedes was long and hotly contested by Slavonic patriots, but there is now a general consensus of opinion that the evidence for it is too strong to be overthrown. Not only have we the evidence given above, but also the very names Rus and Varangian can be satisfactorily explained only on this theory. The name Rus is the Slavonic Rus, the Greek, and Rus, the Arabic form of the Finnish name for Sweden, viz. Ruotsi. This name was originally derived from Rother or Rothen, the name of certain districts of Uppland and Östergötland, whose inhabitants were known as Rodskarlar or Rodsmine. The Finns had early come into relation with the Swedes, and they used the name of those people with whom they were in earliest and most intimate contact for the whole Swedish nationality. When these Swedes settled in Russia, the Finns applied the same term to the new colonists, and the term came to be adopted later into the various Slavonic dialects. We are most familiar with the term Varangian or Variag, to use the Slavonic form, as applied to the famous guard of the Byzantine emperors, which seems to have been formed in the latter half of the 10th century and was largely composed of Norwegian, Icelandic and Swedish recruits. In Russian and Arabic historians, on the other hand, the term is used rather in an ethnographic or geographic sense. We have seen that it was thus used by Nestor, and similarly we find the Baltic commonly spoken of as the Varangian Sea, both in Russian and in Arabic records. All the evidence tends to show that this was the earlier sense of the term, and we find it gradually displacing the term Rus, even in Byzantine historians. The word itself is of Scandinavian origin and means those who are bound together by a pledge. The theory which best explains its various uses is that put forward by Dr. Wilhelm Thomsen, viz. That it originated among the Northmen who settled in Russia, i.e. among the ancient Rus, and that under that term they denoted those people west of the Baltic who were related to them by nationality. From the Rus the word passed into the Slavonic language as variag, into the Greek as barangoi, where it was often used in the restricted sense of members of the imperial guard largely recruited from this nation, and into the Arabic as varank. Dr. Thompson adduces two happy parallels for the somewhat remarkable history of the terms Russian and Varangian. The term Russian came to be used as their own name by the Slavonic peoples, who were once ruled over by the Rus, in much the same way the term Frankish or French was adopted by the Gaulish population of France from its Germanic conquerors. The term Varangian, ultimately the name for a nation or group of nations, came to be used of a military force once largely recruited from those nations, much in the same way as the term Swiss was applied to the papal guard long after that guard had ceased to be recruited from the Swiss nation exclusively. The belief in the Scandinavian origin of the Rus is amply supported by archaeological evidence. The large number of Arabic coins found in Sweden (more especially in Gothland) and in Russia itself points to an extensive trade with the Orient, whose route lay chiefly to the east of the Caspian Sea and then along the valley of the Volga. The dates of the coins point to the years between 850 and 1000 as those of most active intercourse with the East. Equally interesting is the large number of Western coins, more especially Anglo-Saxon pennies and skyats, which have been found in Russia. They probably represent portions of our Danegeld, which had come into the hands of the Swedes, either in trade or war. Viking brooches of the characteristic oval shape with the familiar zoomorphic ornamentation have been found in Western Russia, and one stone with a runic inscription belonging to the 11th century and showing evidence of connection with Gothland has been found in a burial mound in Berezan, an island at the mouth of the Dnieper. Professor Braun says that no others have been found because of the rarity of suitable stone. How long the Rus maintained their distinctively Scandinavian nationality it is difficult to determine. Oleg's grandson Sviatoslav bore a distinctively Slavonic name, and henceforward the names of the members of the royal house are uniformly Slavonic, but the connection with Sweden was by no means forgotten. Sviatoslav's son Vladimir the Great secured himself in the rulership of Novgorod in 980 by the aid of variags from over the sea, and established a band of variag warriors in the chief city of Kiev. But the Viking age was drawing to a close. Variag auxiliaries are mentioned for the last time in 1043, and it is probable that by the middle of the 11th century the Scandinavian settlers had been almost completely Slavonicized. Of their permanent influence on the Russian people and on Russian institutions it is, in the present state of our knowledge, almost impossible to speak. Attempts have been made to distinguish Scandinavian elements in the old Russian law and language, but with no very definite results, and we must content ourselves with the knowledge that the Vikings were all powerful in western and southern Russia during the greater part of 2 centuries, carrying on an extensive trade with the east, establishing Novgorod, the new town, on the Volga under the name Holmgarthur, and founding a dynasty which ruled in Kiev and became a considerable power in Eastern Europe, negotiating on terms of equality with the Byzantine emperors. Mention has already been made more than once of the way in which the Northmen entered the service of the emperors of Constantinople, or Miklagarðr, the great city, as they called it. From here they visited all parts of the Mediterranean. When Harold Hardrada was in the service of the emperor he sailed through the Grecian archipelago to Sicily and Africa. There he stayed several years, conquering some 80 cities for his master and gaining rich treasures for himself. One interesting memorial of these journeys still remains to us. At the entrance to the arsenal in Venice stands a marble lion brought from Athens in 1687. Formerly it stood at the harbour of the Piraeus, known thence as the Porto Leone. On the sides of the lion are carved two long runic inscriptions arranged in snake-like bands. The runes are too much worn to be deciphered, but they are unquestionably of Scandinavian origin, and the snake bands closely resemble those that may be seen on certain runic stones in Sweden. The carving was probably done by Swedes from Uppland about the middle of the 10th century. One can hardly imagine a more striking illustration of the extent and importance of the Viking movement in Europe. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of the Vikings by Alan Mawer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kevin Johnson. Chapter 8. Viking Civilization. The activities of the Vikings were all embracing, and before any attempt can be made to estimate their influence in the various countries which came permanently under their rule, or were brought more or less closely into touch with them, some account, however slight, must be given of Scandinavian civilization at this time, both on its spiritual and on its material sides. For the former aspect we must turn chiefly to the poems and sagas of Old Norse literature, for the latter to the results of modern archaeological research. So far as the poems and sagas are concerned, it is well to remember that they were to a large extent composed in Iceland and reflect the somewhat peculiar type of civilization developed there at a period just subsequent to the Viking Age itself. This civilization differs necessarily from that developed in Scandinavia or in the other Scandinavian settlements in that it was free from Western influence, but this is to some extent compensated for by the fact that we get in Iceland a better picture of the inherent possibilities of Viking civilization when developed on independent lines. At the beginning of the Viking Age, the Scandinavian peoples were in a transitional stage of development. On the one hand, there was still much, both in their theory and in their practice of life, that savoured of primitive barbarism, while on the other, in the development of certain phases of human activity, more especially in those of war, trade, and social organisation, they were considerably ahead of many of their European neighbours. More than one writer has commented upon the strange blending of barbarism and culture which constitutes Viking civilization. It is evident when we study their daily life, and it is emphasised in the story of their slow and halting passage from heathenism to Christianity. We need not travel far to find examples of their barbarism. Their cruelty in warfare is a commonplace among the historians of the period. When the Irish found the Danes cooking their food on spits stuck in the bodies of their fallen foes, and asked why they did anything so hateful, the answer came, "Why not? If the other side had been victorious, they would have done the same with us." The custom of cutting the blood eagle (i.e. cutting the ribs in the shape of an eagle and pulling the lungs through the opening) was a well-known form of vengeance taken on the slayer of one's father if captured in battle, and is illustrated in the story of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok himself. Another survival of primitive life was the famous Berserk Fury, when men in the heat of battle were seized with sudden madness and, according to the popular belief, received a double portion of strength and lost all sense of bodily pain, a custom for which Dr. Bugge finds an apt parallel in the running amok of the races of the Malay Peninsula. Children were tossed on the point of the spear, and the Viking leader who discouraged the custom was nicknamed Barnakarl, i.e. children's friend. In contrast to these methods of warfare stands their skill in fortification, in which they taught many lessons both to their English and to their Frankish adversaries. Their readiness in adapting themselves to new conditions of warfare, and their clever strategy whereby they again and again outwitted their opponents. The same contrast meets us when we consider the position of woman among them. The chroniclers make many references to their lust after woman. We hear in an English chronicler how they combed their hair, indulged in Sabbath baths, often changed their clothes, and in various ways cultivated bodily beauty in order that they might the more readily overcome the chastity of the matrons and make concubines even of the daughters of the nobility. Wandering from country to country they often had wives in each, and polygamy would seem to have been the rule, at least among the leaders. In Ireland we hear of what seem to have been veritable harems, while in Russia we are told of the great grandson of Rurik, the founder of the Russian kingdom, that he had more than 800 concubines, though we may perhaps suspect the influence of oriental custom in this case. Yet, side by side with all this, the legitimate wife was esteemed and honoured, and attained a position and took a part in national life which was quite unusual in those days. In the account of an Arabic embassy to the Vikings of the West we have a vivid picture of the freedom of their married life. Auðr, the widow of Olaf the White, after the fall of her son Thorstein, took charge of the fortunes of her family and is one of the figures that stand out most clearly in the early settlement of Iceland. We have only to turn to the Icelandic sagas to see before us a whole gallery of portraits, dark and fair alike, of women cast in heroic mould, while the stone of Dirna in Hadland, bearing the runic inscription Gunvor, daughter of Thirek, built a bridge to commemorate her daughter Astrid. She was the most gracious maiden in Hadland, gives us one of the most attractive pictures of womanhood left to us from the Viking age. It must be added, however, that beside the runic inscription the stone bears carvings of the Christ child, the star in the east and the three kings, and this may serve to remind us that the age was one in which the peoples of the north passed from heathenism to Christianity, though the passage was a slow one and by no means complete even at the close of the period. It is probable that the first real knowledge of the White Christ came, as is so often the case, with the extension of trade, Frisians trading with Scandinavia and Danes and Swedes settling in Frisia and elsewhere for the same purpose. St Willibrord at the beginning of the 8th century and Archbishop Ebbo of Reims in 823, as papal legate among the northern peoples, undertook missions to Denmark, but it was in 826, when King Harold was baptised at Mainz, that the first real opportunity came for the preaching of Christianity in Denmark. Harold was accompanied on his return by St Ansgar, a monk from Corvey and a man filled with religious zeal. After 2 years' mission in Denmark, St Ansgar sailed to Sweden, where he was graciously received at Björkö by the king Björn. He made many converts and on his return home in 831 was made Archbishop of Hamburg and given, jointly with Ebbo, jurisdiction over the whole of the northern realms. Hamburg was devastated in 845 and St Ansgar was then appointed to the bishopric of Bremen, afterwards united to a restored archbishopric of Hamburg. He laboured in Denmark once more and established churches at Slesvig and Ribe. He conducted a second mission to Sweden and his missionary zeal remained unabated until his death in 865. His work was carried on by his successor and biographer St Rimbert and by many others. Their preaching was however confined to Jutland and South Sweden, and there is no evidence of any popular movement towards Christianity. Gorm the Old was a steadfast pagan, but Gorm's son Harold Bluetooth was a zealous promoter of Christianity. His enthusiasm may have been exaggerated by monastic chroniclers in contrast to the heathenism of his son Svein, but with the accession of Cnut all fears of a reversion to heathendom were at an end. Cnut was a devout son of the church. The first Danish settlers in England were entirely heathen in sentiment, but they were soon brought into close contact with Christianity, and the terms of the peace of Edward and Guthrum in the early years of the 10th century show that already Christianity was making its way in the Danelagh. In the course of this century both archbishoprics were held by men of Danish descent, and the excesses of the early 11th century were due, not to the Danish settlers, but to the heathen followers of Olaf Tryggvason and Svein Forkbeard. Similarly, the Danish settlers in Normandy were within a few years numbered among the church's most enthusiastic supporters, and Rollo's own son and successor William was anxious to become a monk. The story of the preaching of Christianity in Norway is a checkered one. The first attempt to establish the Christian faith was made by Hákon Aðalsteins's Fóstri. Baptised and educated in England, he began warily, inducing those who were best beloved by him to become Christians, but he soon came into conflict with the more ardent followers of paganism. At the great autumn festival at Lade, when the cups of memory were drunk, Earl Sigurd signed a cup to Odin, but the king made the sign of the cross over his cup. Earl Sigurd pacified popular clamour by saying that the king had made the sign of the hammer and consecrated the cup to Thor. The next day the king would not eat the horse flesh used in their offerings nor drink the blood from it. The people were angry and the king compromised by inhaling the steam from the offering through a linen cloth placed over the sacrificial kettle. But no one was satisfied, and at the next winter feast the king had to eat some bits of horse liver and to drink crossless all the cups of memory. Hákon died a Christian, but Eyvindur Skaldaspillir in Hákonarmál describes how he was welcomed by Odin to Valhalla. Earl Hákon Sigurdsson, nicknamed Blótjarl, i.e. sacrifice earl, was a zealous heathen, but Olaf Tryggvason after his succession in 995 promoted the cause of Christianity by every means in his power, and it was largely by this that he owed his ultimate overthrow. Then, after a brief interval, the crown passed to St Olaf, greatest of all Christian champions in Norway, and during his reign that country became definitely Christian, though his rough and ready methods of conversion were hardly likely to secure anything but a purely formal and outward adhesion to the new faith. Sweden was the most reluctant of the three northern realms to accept Christianity, and the country remained almost entirely heathen until the close of the Viking period. The story of the Norse settlers in Ireland and Western Islands in their relation to Christianity was very much that of the Danes in England. Celtic Christianity had a firm hold on these countries, and from the earliest period of the settlement many of the Vikings adopted the Christian faith. Among the settlers in Iceland who came from the west were many Christians, and Auðr herself gave orders at her death that she should be buried on the seashore below the tide mark rather than lie in unhallowed ground. Most of the settlers undoubtedly remained heathen. In 996 a ring sacred to Thor was taken from a temple in Dublin, and in 1000 King Brian destroyed a grove sacred to the same god just north of the city. But side by side with incidents of this kind must be placed others like that of the sparing of the churches, hospitals and almshouses when Armagh was sacked in 921, or the retirement of Anlaf Cuaran to the monastery at Iona in 981. In Ireland as elsewhere there seems to have been a recrudescence of heathenism in the early years of the 11th century, and the great fight at Clontarf was regarded as a struggle between pagan and Christian. Outwardly the Scandinavian world had largely declared its adhesion to Christianity by the close of the Viking period, but we must remember that the medieval church was satisfied if her converts passed through the ceremony of baptism and observed her rites, though their sentiments often remained heathen. Except in purely formal fashion, it is impossible to draw a definite line of demarcation between Christian and heathen, and the acceptance of Christianity is of importance not so much from any change of outlook which it produced in individuals, as because it brought the peoples of the north into closer touch with the general life and culture of medieval Europe. Leaders freely accepted baptism, often more than once, and even confirmation as part of a diplomatic bargain, while their profession of Christianity made no difference to their Viking way of life. Even on formal lines the church had to admit of compromise, as for example in the practice of prime signing, whereby when Vikings visited Christian lands as traders or entered the service of Christian kings for payment, they often allowed themselves to be signed with the cross, which secured their admission to intercourse with Christian communities, but left them free to hold the faith which pleased them best. Strange forms and mixtures of belief arose in the passage from one faith to the other. Helgi the Lean was a Christian, but called on Thor in the hour of need. The Christian saints with their wonder-working powers were readily adopted into the Norse pantheon, and Vikings by their prayers and offerings secured the help of St Patrick in Ireland and of St Germanus in France in times of defeat and pestilence, while we hear of a family of settlers in Iceland who gave up all faith except a belief in the power of St Columba. On sculptured stones in the west may be found pictures of Ragnarök, of Balder and of Loki together with the sign of the cross. Some of the heathen myths themselves show Christian influence. The Balder story with its echoes of the lamentations for the suffering Christ belongs to the last stage of Norse heathendom, while a heathen skald makes Christ sit by the fountain of fate as the mighty destroyer of the giants. When the virtue had gone out of their old beliefs, many fell a prey to the grossest superstition, worshipping the rocks and groves and rivers once thought to be the dwelling place of the gods. Others renounced faith in Christian and heathen gods alike, and the nickname godless is by no means rare among the settlers in Iceland. Of such it is often said that they believed in themselves or had no faith in aught except their own strength and power, while in the saga of Frithjof we hear how the hero paid little heed to the sanctity of the temple of Balder and that the love of Ingiborg meant more to him than the wrath of the gods. For a parallel to such audacious scepticism as that of Frithjof we must turn to southern lands and later times with Aucassin's In Paradise what have I to win? Therein I seek not to enter, but only to have my Nicolette, my sweet lady that I love so well. For some the way of escape came not by superstition or by scepticism, but in mystic speculation, in pure worship of the powers of nature. Thus we hear of the Icelander Þorkell Mani, whom all praised for the excellence of his way of life, that in his last illness he was carried out into the sunshine so that he might commend himself into the hands of the god who made the sun, or of the Gothi Askelt, who, even in the hour of famine, deemed it was more fitting to honour the Creator by caring for the aged and the children than to relieve distress by putting these helpless ones to death. One other illustration of the declining force of heathenism must be mentioned. It is to the Viking age that we owe the poems of the older Edda, that storehouse of Norse mythology and cosmogony. They are almost purely heathen in sentiment, and yet one feels that it could only be in an age when belief in the old gods was passing away that the authors of these poems could have struck those notes of detachment, irony and even of burlesque which characterise so many of them. The condition of faith and belief in the Viking age was, then, chaotic, but, fortunately for purposes of clear statement, there was, to the Norse mind at least, no necessary connection between beliefs and morality, between faith and conduct, and the ideas on which they based their philosophy and practice of life are fairly distinct. The central idea which dominate the Norse view of life are an ever-present sense of the passingness of all things and a deep consciousness of the overruling power of fate. All earthly things are transitory, and the one thing which lasts is a good name. Wealth dies, kinsmen die, man himself must die, but the fame which a man wins rightly for himself never dies. One thing I know that never dies, the judgment passed on every man that dies, says the poet of Havamal, the great storehouse of the gnomic wisdom of the Norsemen. All things are unstable and transitory. Let no man therefore be arrogant or overconfident. The wise man will never praise the day before it is evening. Prudence and foresight are ever necessary. All things are determined by a fate which is irrevocable and cannot be avoided. Every man must die the death that is appointed for him, and the man whose final day has not yet come may face unmoved the greatest danger. This sense of an inevitable fate must lead to no weakening of character or weariness of life. Death must be faced with cheerful stoicism, and our judgment of the worth of any man must depend on the way in which he awaits the decree of fate. Place no great trust in others, whether friend or foe, least of all place trust in woman. Womanes counsels ben full ofte colde, says Chaucer in the Nun's Priest Tale, using an old Scandinavian proverb. Be friendly to your friends and a foeman to your foes. Practice hospitality and hate lying and untruthfulness. With their enemies the Vikings had an evil reputation for cunning and deceit, but when we study the incidents on which the charge was based, as for example the story of the capture of Luna, or the oft repeated trick of feigning flight only to lure the enemy away from safe ground, one must confess that they show an enemy outwitted rather than deceived. This aspect of Viking character perhaps finds its best illustration in the figure of Odin. His common epithets are the wise, the prudent, the sagacious. He is a god of witchcraft and knows all the secret powers of nature and stands in contrast to the simple-minded Thor, endowed with mighty strength but less polished and refined. The development of the worship of Odin in Norway belongs specially to the latter Iron Age, and it is worthy of note that his worship seems to have prevailed chiefly in military circles among princes and their retainers. The Vikings were guilty of two besetting sins: immoderate love of wine and of woman. Of their relations to women enough has been said already. Their drunken revelry is best illustrated by the story of the orgy which led to the death of St Alphege in London in 1012, when, after drinking their fill of the wine they had brought from abroad, they pelted the bishop with bones from the feast and finally pierced his skull with the spike of the back of an axe. Of sin in the Christian sense the Vikings had no conception. An Irish chronicler tells us indeed that the Danes have a certain piety in that they can refrain from flesh and from woman for a time, but a truer description is probably that given by Adam of Bremen when he says that the Danes can weep neither for their sins nor for their dead. The chief occupations of the Vikings were trade and war, but we must beware of drawing a too rigid distinction between adventurers and peaceful stay-at-homes. The Vikings, when they settled in England and elsewhere, showed that their previous roving life did not hinder them in the least from settling down as peaceful traders, farmers or peasant labourers, while the figure of Othere or Ottar, to give him his Norse name, who entered the service of King Alfred, may serve to remind us that many a landed gentleman was not above carrying on a good trade with the Finns or undertaking voyages of exploration in the White Sea. Trading in those days was a matter of great difficulty and many risks. The line of division between merchant and Viking was a very thin one, and more than once we read how, when merchants went on a trading expedition, they arranged a truce until their business was concluded and then treated each other as enemies. Trade in Scandinavia was carried on either in fixed centres or in periodical markets held in convenient places. The chief trading centres were the twin towns of Slesvig Hedeby in Denmark, Skiringsar in southwest Norway, and Björkö, Sigtuna and the island of Gothland in Sweden, while an important market was held periodically at Bohuslän on the Gotailv at a place where the boundaries of the three northern kingdoms met. A characteristic incident which happened at this market illustrates the international character of the trade done there. On a certain occasion a wealthy merchant named Gille (the name is Celtic), surnamed the Russian because of his many journeys to that country, set up his booth in the market and received a visit from the Icelander Höskuldr, who was anxious to buy a female slave. Gille drew back a curtain dividing off the inner part of the tent and showed Höskuldr 12 female slaves. Höskuldr bought one, and she proved to be an Irish king's daughter who had been made captive by Viking raiders. The chief exports were furs, horses, wool and fish, while the imports consisted chiefly in articles of luxury, whether for clothing or ornament. There was an extensive trade with the Orient in all such luxuries, and the Vikings seem eagerly to have accumulated wealth of this kind. When Limerick was recaptured by the Irish in 968, they carried off from the Vikings their jewels and their best property, and their saddles beautiful and foreign (probably of Spanish workmanship), their gold and their silver, their beautifully woven cloth of all colours and all kinds, their satins and silken cloths, pleasing and variegated, both scarlet and green, and all sorts of cloth in like manner. They captured too their soft, youthful, bright, matchless girls, their blooming silk-clad young women, and their active, large and well-formed boys. Such captives, whether made by Irish from Norsemen or Norsemen from Irish, would certainly be sold as slaves, for one of the chief branches of trade in those days was the sale as slaves of those made prisoner in war. The expansion of Scandinavian trade took place side by side with, rather than as a result of, Viking activity in war. There is evidence of the presence of traders in the Low Countries early in the 9th century, and already in the days of St Ansgar we hear of a Swedish widow of Björkö who left money for her daughter to distribute among the poor of Dursted. Jomsborg was established to protect and increase Scandinavian trade at Julin, and there were other similar trading centres on the southern and eastern shores of the Baltic. The Viking might busy himself either with trade or war, but whatever his occupation, living as he did in insular or peninsular lands, good ships and good seamanship were essential to his livelihood. Seamen now often abandoned that timid hugging of the coast, sailing only by daytime and in fair weather, which characterised the old Phoenician traders, and boldly sailed across the uncharted main with no help save that of the sun and stars by which to steer their course. It was this boldness of spirit alone which enabled them to reach the lonely Faroes, the distant Shetlands and Orkneys, and the yet more remote Iceland. Irish monks and anchorites had shown similar fearlessness, but their bravery was often that of the fanatic and the mystic rather than the enterprise of the seaman. Boldness of seamanship led to boldness in exploration. From Iceland the Vikings sailed to Greenland and by the year 1000 had discovered Vinland, the northeast part of North America. Ottar rounded the North Cape and sailed the White Sea in the 9th century, while Harold Hardrada in the 11th century made a voyage of polar exploration. Of their ships we know a good deal both from the sagas and from the remains of actual ships preserved to us. The custom of ship burial, i.e. burial in a ship over which a grave chamber covered with a howe or mound was erected, was common in the Viking age, and several such ships have been discovered. The two most famous are those of Gokstad and Oseberg, both found on the shores of Christiania Fjord. The Gokstad vessel is of oak, clinker built, with seats for 16 pairs of rowers, and is 28 feet long and 16 feet broad amidships. It dates from about 900 and in form and workmanship is not surpassed by modern vessels of a similar kind. There is a mast for a single sail, and the rudder, as always in those days, is on the starboard side. The gunwale was decorated with a series of shields painted alternately black and gold. The appearance of the vessel when fully equipped can perhaps best be judged from the pictures of Viking ships to be seen in the Bayeux tapestry. There we may note the parti coloured sail with its variegated stripes, and the rich carvings of the stem and stern. These magnificent sails were a source of much pride to their possessors, and the story is told of Sigurd Jerusalem farer that on his way home from Jerusalem to Constantinople he lay for half a month off Cape Malea, waiting for a side wind, so that his sails might be set lengthwise along the ship and so be better seen by those standing on shore as he sailed up to Constantinople. The stem often ended in a dragon's head done over with gold, whilst the stern was frequently shaped like a dragon's tail, so that the vessel itself was often called a dragon. The Oseberg ship is of a different type. The gunwale is lower and the whole vessel is flatter and broader. It is used as the grave chamber of a woman, and the whole appearance of the vessel, including its richly carved stem, indicates that it was used in calm waters for peaceful purposes. The story of the escape of Herek of Thjota through Copenhagen Sound after the Battle of Helgeau in 1018 illustrates the difference between a trading ship and a ship of war. Herek struck sail and mast, took down the vane, stretched a great tent cloth over the ship's sides and left only a few rowers fore and aft. The rest of the crew were bidden lie flat so that they might not be seen, with the result that the Danes mistook Herek's war galley for a trading vessel laden with herrings or salt and let it pass unchallenged. In the last years of the Viking period, ships increased greatly both in size and number. Olaf Tryggvason's vessel, the Long Serpent, in which he fought his last fight at Svolder, had 30 benches of oars, while Canute the Great had one with 60 pairs of oars. This same king went with a fleet of some 1400 vessels to the conquest of Norway. In battle the weapons of defence were helmet, corselet and shield. The shields were of wood with a heavy iron boss in the centre. The corselets were made of iron rings, leather or thick cloth. The weapons of offence were mainly sword, spear and battle axe. The sword was of the two-edged type and usually had a shallow depression along the middle of the blade known as the blood channel. Above, the blade terminated in a narrow tang, bounded at either end by the hilts. Round the tang and between the hilts was the handle of wood, horn or some similar material, often covered with leather or occasionally with metal. Above the upper hilt was a knob, which gave the sword the necessary balance for a good steady blow. Generally, the knob and the hilts were inlaid with silver, bronze or copper work. The battle axe, the most characteristic of Viking weapons, was of the heavy broad-bladed type. Next to warfare and trade, the chief occupation of the Viking was farming, while his chief amusement was the chase. At home the Viking leader lived the life of an active country gentleman. His favourite sport was hawking, and one of the legendary lives of St Edmund tells how Ragnar Lothbrok himself was driven by stress of storm to land on the East Anglian coast, receiving a hospitable welcome from the king, but ultimately meeting death at the hands of the king's huntsman, who was jealous of his prowess as a fowler. Of the social organisation of the Vikings it is impossible to form a very definite or precise picture. We have in the laws of the Jómsborg settlement the rule of life of a warrior community, but it would be a mistake to imagine that these laws prevailed in all settlements alike. The general structure of their society was aristocratic rather than democratic, but within the aristocracy, which was primarily a military one, the principle of equality prevailed. When asked who was their lord, Rollo's men answered, "We have no lord, we are all equals." But while they admitted no lord, the Vikings were essentially practical. They realised the importance of organised leadership, and we have a succession of able leaders mentioned in the annals of the time. to some of whom the title king was given. These kings, however, are too numerous and too many of them are mentioned together for it to be possible to give the term king in this connection anything like its usual connotation. It would seem rather to have been used for any prince of the royal house, and it was only when the Vikings had formed fixed settlements and come definitely under Western influence that we hear of kings in the ordinary territorial sense, kings of Northumbria, Dublin, Man and the Isles, or East Anglia. We hear also of jarls or earls, either as Viking leaders or as definite territorial rulers, as for example the Orkney earls, and more than one earl who is mentioned as ruling in Dublin, but these earls usually held their lands under the authority of a king. By the side of kings and earls mention is made both in the Danelagh and also in the Western Islands of law men. It is difficult exactly to define their position and function. Originally these men were simply experts in the law who expounded it in the popular thing or assembly, and were the spokesmen of the people as against the king and the court, but sometimes they assumed judicial functions, acting for example in Sweden as assessors to the king, who was supreme judge. In their home life we find the same strange mixture of civilization and barbarism which marks them elsewhere. Their houses were built of timber covered with clay, there was no proper hearth, and the smoke from the fire made its way out as best it could through the turf covered roof. The chief furniture of the room consisted in beds, benches, long tables and chests, and in the houses of the rich these would at the close of the period often be carved with stories from the old heroic or mythologic legends, while the walls might be covered with tapestry. Prominent in the chieftain's hall stood the carved pillars which supported his high seat and were considered sacred. When some of the settlers first sailed to Iceland they threw overboard their high seat pillars which they had brought with them, and chose as the site of their new abode the place where these pillars were cast ashore. In clothing and adornment there can be no question that our Viking forefathers had attained a high standard of luxury. Any visitor to the great national museums at Copenhagen, Stockholm or Christiania must be impressed by the wealth of personal ornaments displayed before him, magnificent brooches of silver and bronze, arm rings and neck rings of gold and silver, large beads of silver, glass, rock crystal, amber and cornelian. At one time it was commonly assumed that these ornaments, often displaying the highest artistic skill, were simply plunder taken by the Vikings from nations more cultured and artistic than themselves, but patient investigation has shown that the majority of them were wrought in Scandinavia itself. The most characteristic of Viking ornaments is undoubtedly the brooch. It was usually oval in shape and the concave surface was covered with a framework of knobs and connecting bands, which divided it into a series of fields (to use the heraldic term), which could themselves be decorated with the characteristic ornamentation of the period. The commonest form of oval brooch was that with 9 knobs on a single plate, but in the later examples the plate is often doubled. The brooches themselves were of bronze, the knobs usually of silver with silver wire along the edge of the brooch. These knobs have now often disappeared and the bronze has become dull with verdigris, so that it is difficult to form an idea of their original magnificence. The oval brooches were used to fasten the outer mantle and were usually worn in pairs, either on the breast or on the shoulders, and examples of them have been found from Russia in the east to Ireland on the west. Other types of brooch are also found, straight armed, trilobed and round. Such brooches were often worn in the middle of the bosom, a little below the oval ones. Other ornaments besides brooches are common: arm rings, neck rings, pendants. One of the most interesting of the pendants is a ring with a series of small silver Thor's hammers which was probably used as a charm against ill luck. All these ornaments alike are in silver rather than gold, and it has been said that if the post-Roman period of Scandinavian archaeology be called the Age of Gold, the Viking period should be named the Age of Silver. The style of ornamentation used in these articles of personal adornment as well as in objects of more general use such as horse trappings is that commonly known to German archaeologists as Tierornamentik, i.e. animal or zoomorphic ornamentation. This last translation may sound pedantic, but it is the most accurate description of the style, for we have no attempt to represent the full form of any animal that ever had actual existence. Rather, we find the various limbs of animals, heads, legs, tails, woven into one another in fantastic design in order to cover a certain surface area which requires decoration. The animals are ornaments and treated as such. They are stretched and curved, lengthened and shortened, refashioned and remodelled just as the space which they must fill requires. This style was once called the dragon style, but the term is misleading as there is no example belonging to the Viking period proper of any attempt to represent a dragon, i.e. some fantastic animal with wings. Such creatures belong to a later period. The zoomorphic style did not have its origin during the Viking period. It is based on that of a preceding period in the culture of North German peoples, but it received certain characteristic developments at this time, more especially under the influence of Irish and Frankish art. Irish art had begun to influence that of Scandinavia even before the Viking period began, and the development of intercourse between North and West greatly strengthened that influence. To Frankish influence were due not only certain developments of Tierornamentik, but also the use of figures from the plant world for decorative purposes. One of the finest brooches preserved to us from this period is of Frankish workmanship, a magnificent trilobed brooch of gold with acanthus leaf ornamentation. This leaf work was often imitated by Scandinavian craftsmen, but the imitation is usually rude and unconvincing. Traces are also to be found of Oriental and more especially of Arabic influence in certain forms of silver ornamentation, but finds of articles of actual Eastern manufacture are more common than finds of articles of Scandinavian origin showing Eastern influences in their workmanship. Buried treasure from the Viking period is very common. It was a popular belief sanctioned by the express statement of Odin that a man would enjoy in Valhalla whatsoever he had himself buried in the earth. Another common motive in the burial of treasure was doubtless the desire to find a place of security against robbery and plunder. Treasure thus secreted would often be lost sight of at the owner's death. To the burial customs of the Viking period also we owe much of our knowledge of their weapons, clothing, ornaments and even of their domestic utensils. The dead were as a rule cremated, at least during the early part of the Viking period. The body burned or unburned was either buried in a mound of earth forming a how or was laid under the surface of the ground, and the grave marked by stones arranged in a circle, square, triangle or oval, sometimes even imitating the outlines of a ship. The hows were often of huge size. The largest of the three King's Hows at Old Uppsala is 30 feet high and 200 feet broad. A large how was very necessary in the well-known ship burial when the dead man (or woman) was placed in a grave chamber on board his ship and the ship was drawn on land and buried within a how. Men and women alike were buried in full dress, and the men usually have all their weapons with them. In the latter case weapons tend to take the place of articles of domestic use such as are found in the graves of an earlier period, and the change points to a new conception of the future life. It is now a life in which warriors feast with Odin in Valhalla on benches that are covered with corselets. A careful examination of Norwegian graves has proved fairly definitely the existence of the custom of sati during the Viking period, and the evidence of the Arab historian Ibn Fadlan seems to show that the same custom prevailed among the Rus. Horses, dogs, hawks and other animals were often buried with their masters, and the remains of such, burned or unburned, have frequently been found. The varying customs attending burial are happily illustrated in the two accounts preserved to us of the burial of King Harold Hildetan, who died circa 750. The accounts were written down long after the actual event, but they probably give us a good picture of familiar incidents in burial ceremonies of the Viking period. One account (in a late saga) tells how, on the morrow of the great fight at Bravalla, King Ring caused search to be made for the body of his kinsman Harold. When the body was found, it was washed and placed in the chariot which Harold used in the fight. A large mound was raised and the chariot was drawn into the mound by Harold's own horse. The horse was now killed, and Ring gave his own saddle to Harold, telling him that he might ride or drive to Valhalla just as it pleased him best. A great memorial feast was held, and Ring bade his warriors and nobles throw into the mound large rings of gold and silver and good weapons before it was finally closed. The other account (in Saxo) tells how Ring harnessed his own horse to Harold's chariot and bade him drive quickly to Valhalla as the best in battle, and when he came to Odin to prepare goodly quarters for friend and foe alike. The pyre was then kindled, and by Ring's command the Danes placed Harold's ship upon it. When the fire destroyed the body, the king commanded his followers to walk around the pyre and chant a lament, making rich offerings of weapons, gold and treasure, so that the fire might mount the higher in honour of the great king. So the body was burned, the ashes were collected, laid in an urn and sent to Weir, there to be buried with the horse and the weapons in royal fashion. There are many curious coincidences of detail between these accounts and that given by Ibn Fadlan of the burial of a Rus warrior, and every detail of them has at one time or another been confirmed by archaeological evidence. The dead were commemorated by the How itself, but Bautasteinar, i.e. memorial stones, were also erected either on the How or, more commonly, elsewhere. In course of time these monuments came to be inscribed with runes. Usually the inscription is of the most formal type, giving the name of the dead person, the name of the man who raised the memorial, and sometimes also that of the man who carved the runes. Occasionally there is some more human touch, as in the wording of the Dirna runes, and in the latter part of the Viking period we often find pictures and even scenes inscribed on the stones. This is true of the Dirna stone. The Jelling stone has a figure of Christ on it, while there is a famous rock inscription in Sweden representing scenes from the Sigurd story (Regan smithy, hammer, tongs and bellows, Sigurd piercing Fafnir with his sword, the birds whose speech Sigurd understood), encircled by a serpent (Fafnir), bearing a long runic inscription. The runic alphabet itself was the invention of an earlier age. It is based chiefly on the old Roman alphabet, with such modifications of form and symbol as were necessitated by the different sounds in the Teutonic tongues, and by the use of such unyielding materials as wood and stone. Straight lines were preferred to curved ones, and sloping to horizontal. During the Viking period it was simplified, and runic inscriptions are found from the valley of the Dnieper on the east to Man in the west, and from Iceland on the north to the Piraeus in the south. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the Vikings by Mawer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kevin Johnson. Chapter 9. Scandinavian influence in the Orkneys, Shetlands, the Western Islands and Man. Of all the countries visited by the Vikings, it is undoubtedly the British Isles which bear most definitely the marks of their presence. The history and civilization of Ireland, the Orkneys and Shetlands, the Western Islands and Man, Scotland and England were profoundly affected by the Viking movement, and its influence is none the less interesting because it varies greatly from place to place in both character and intensity. These variations are doubtless due in part to differences of political and social organisation as between Norsemen and Danes, or between men coming from scattered districts of the as yet loosely coordinated kingdoms of Denmark and Norway, but their chief cause lies in the wide divergences in the social and political conditions of the lands in which they settled. The Orkneys and the Shetlands were settled by the Norsemen earlier than any other part of the British Isles, and they formed part of the Norse kingdom till 1468. It is not surprising therefore that the great Norse historian Munch describes them as ligeså norskt som Norge selv, as Norse as Norway itself. The Old Norse speech was still spoken there by a few people until the end of the 18th century, and we have a version of the ballad of King Orfeo taken down from recital at the close of that century with the Norse refrain still preserved: Skawen urtla grun war gjorten han grun orlak, i.e. probably Skoven arle grun kvor hjorten han gar arlig, early green's the wood where the hart goes yearly. Place nomenclature is almost entirely Norse, and the modern dialects are full of Norse words. Several runic inscriptions have been found, the most famous being that at Maeshow in Hrossi, made by Norse crusaders when they wintered there in 1152-3 and amused themselves by breaking open the how, probably to look for treasure, and scoring their runes on the walls of the grave chamber. In the system of landholding, the Udallers are an interesting survival of the Old Norse freeholders. The Udaller held his land without condition or limitation in any feudal sense, says Mr Gilbert Gowdy, i.e. he held his Udal on precisely the same free terms that the native Norseman did his Othal. From the Shetlands and the Orkneys the Norsemen crossed to the Scottish mainland. Sutherland (i.e. the land south of the Orkneys), Caithness, Ross and Cromarty are full of Norse place names, and Norse influence may be traced even further south. The Hebrides were also largely influenced by the Norsemen. Together with Man, they formed a Norse kingdom down to the middle of the 13th century. Many of the islands themselves and their chief physical features bear Norse names. Many personal names, e.g. Macaulay, son of Aule or Olaf, are of Norse origin, and there are many Norse words in the Gaelic both of the islands and the mainland. These words have undergone extensive changes and much corruption in a language very different in form and sounds from that of their original source, and their recognition is a difficult problem. There is at present a danger of exaggerating this Norse element, the existence of which was long overlooked. Similarly, affinities have been traced between Scandinavian and Gaelic popular tales and folklore, but the evidence is too vague and uncertain to be of much value. It is however in Man that we get the most interesting traces of the presence of the Norsemen. Here as elsewhere we have place names and personal names bearing witness to their presence, but we have much else besides. Some 26 rune inscribed crosses have been preserved to us. The crosses are Celtic in form and to a large extent in ornament also, but we find distinct traces of the Scandinavian animal ornamentation. The inscriptions are short and for the most part give only the name of the memorial raiser and the memorised. One bears the rune writer's own proud boast, "Gout made this and all in man." More interesting than the runes are the sculptured figures. On 4 of the crosses we have representations of incidents from the Sigurd story: Sigurd slaying Fafnir, Sigurd roasting Fafnir's heart and cooling his fingers in his mouth after trying too soon if the heart was done, Loki slaying the otter. We also have pictures of Thor's adventure with the serpent of Mythgartr and of Odin's last fight with Fenrir's wolf. These sculptured stones are probably among the latest of those found in Man and have their chief parallel in stones found in Sweden. Possibly it was to settlers from Man also that we owe the famous Gosforth cross in Cumberland with its picture of Thor's fishing for the serpent. In addition to all this we have the Manx legal system as a standing witness to Norse influence. The chief executive and legislative authority in the island (after the governor) is the Tynwald court. That court takes its name from the Old Norse Thingvallr, the plain where the Thing or popular assembly meets, and the House of Keys, which is the oldest division of the court, consisted originally of 24 members, a number perhaps due to Scandinavian influence, being a combination of 2 groups of 12 lawmen. These men, who have the keys of the law in their bosom, closely resemble the law men or speakers of the Icelandic assembly. All laws to be valid must be promulgated from the Tynwald hill, which corresponds to the Lögberg or law hill of the Icelandic Althing. When the court is held the coroner fences it against all disturbance or disorder, just as in the old Norwegian Gulathing we hear of vei bond or sanctuary ropes drawn around the assembly. It was possibly from Man that a good number of the Norse settlers in Cumberland, Westmorland and North Lancashire came, and others may have settled in Galloway. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of the Vikings by Alan Mawer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kevin Johnson. Chapter 10. Scandinavian influence in Ireland. At the time of the Viking invasions of Ireland, the various provincial kingdoms were held in loose confederation under the authority of the ardri or High King, but these kingdoms stood in constantly shifting relations of friendship and hostility towards one another and were themselves often split into factions under rival chieftains. There was no national army like the English fyrd. Rather it consisted of a number of tribes, each commanded by their own chief, and though the chief owed allegiance to the king, the bond was a frail one. The tribe was further divided into septs, and the army was utterly lacking in any cohesive principle. It is no wonder that for many years the Irish showed themselves quite unable to cope with the attacks of forces so well organised as those of the Norse and Danish Vikings. In vivid contrast to the chaos in political and military organisation stand the missionary enthusiasm of the Irish Church and the high level of education and culture which prevailed among her clergy and literati. In the Orkneys and the Shetlands such names as Papa Westray or Papa Stronsay bear witness to the presence of Irish priests or papi as the Norsemen called them. Irish anchorites had at one time settled in the Faroes, and when the Norsemen first settled in Iceland (circa 870) they found Irish monks already there. The monastic schools of Ireland were centres of learning and religious instruction for the whole of Western Europe, while Irish missionaries had founded monasteries in Italy, Switzerland, Germany and France. Unfortunately, religion and culture seem to have been almost entirely without influence on the body politic, and as the Vikings had at least in the early days no respect for the religion or the learning of the Irish nation, there was nothing to prevent them from devastating Irish monasteries and carrying off the stores of treasured wealth which they contained. No plunder was more easily won, and it was only when they themselves had fallen under Christian influences and had come to appreciate Irish literary and artistic skill that they showed themselves more kindly disposed towards these homes of learning. One feature must at once strike the observer who compares the Viking settlements in Ireland with those in England, viz. That Viking influence in Ireland is definitely concentrated in the great coast towns Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork and Limerick, and the districts immediately around them. Irish place nomenclature bears very definite witness to this fact. Ford in Strangford and Carlingford Loughs, Waterford and Wexford is Old Norse fjorður, a fjord. Low in Arklow and Wicklow is Old Norse low, low-lying flat grasslands lying by the water's edge. The Old Norse a, an island, is found in Lambay, Dalkay, Dursey Head and Ireland's Eye (for Ireland's A). Howth is Old Norse hofuth, a head. Carnsore and Greenore Point contain Old Norse air, a sandy point pushing out into the sea. Smurwick contains the familiar Old Norse vik, a bay or creek, while the Copeland Islands off Belfast Lough are the Old Norse Kopmanayr, the Merchants' Islands. All these are found on or off the coast, while the number of Scandinavian names found inland is extremely limited. The most interesting perhaps is Leixlip on the Liffey, a name derived from Old Norse Laxalaup, salmon leap. Donegal, Fingal and Gaultier are Celtic names, but they mark the presence of the northern Gaul or foreigners, while the Stur in Ulster, Leinster and Munster is Old Norse Stather (plural of stather, place, abode), suffixed to the Old Gaelic names of these provinces. There was free intermarriage between Norse and Irish, but the strength of the clan system kept the races distinct and there was no such infiltration of the whole population as took place in the English Danelagh. This system prevented any such settlement of Norsemen upon their own farms as took place in England, and the invaders lived almost entirely in the coast towns and the districts in their immediate neighbourhood, busying themselves with trade and shipping. Though the settlements were limited in their extent, we must not underrate their influence on Irish history generally. They gave the impetus there, as elsewhere, to the growth of town life, and from the period of Viking rule dates the origin of the chief Irish towns. To them also was due the great expansion, if not the birth, of Irish trade. Mention has been made of the wealth of Limerick, drawn chiefly from trade with France and Spain, and the other towns were not behind Limerick. The naval power of Dublin stretched from Waterford to Dundalk. The Irish Channel swarmed with Viking fleets, and many of the shipping terms in use in Gaelic are loanwords from the Norse. It is probably to the trading activities of Vikings from the chief ports of Ireland that we owe the sprinkling of names of Norse origin which we find along the Welsh coast from the Dee to the Severn, Great Ormshead, Anglesey, Ramsay, Stockholm Island, Flatholm and Steepholm, and to them may be due the establishment of Swansea, earlier Swansea, Haverfordwest and possibly Bideford as Norse colonies in the Bristol Channel. We know in later times of several Norsemen who were living in Cardiff, Bristol, Swansea and Haverfordwest. Norse influence in Ireland probably reached its climax in the 10th century. The Battle of Clontarf offered a serious check, and though there was still a succession of Norse kings and earls in Dublin, they had to acknowledge the authority of the Ardri. The line of Sigtryggr of the Silken Beard came to an end by the middle of the 11th century, and the rulership of Dublin fell into the hands of various Norse families from other Irish settlements and from Man and the Isles. From 1078 to 94 it was under the rule of the great conqueror Godred Crovan from Man. and its connection with that kingdom was only severed finally when Magnus Barefoot came on his great western expedition in 1103 and brought man into direct allegiance to the kings of Norway. Celtic influence must have been strong in the Norse families themselves. Several of the kings bear Gaelic names, and it is probably from this period that such familiar names as MacLamont or MacCalmont, MacIver and MacQuistan date, where the Gaelic patronymic prefix has been added to the Norse names Lagmaðr, Ivar and Eystein. While Norse power in Dublin was on the decline as a political force, it is curious to note that the vigorous town life and the active commerce instituted by the Norse settlers made that city of ever increasing importance as a centre of Irish life and Irish interests generally. And there can be no question that it was the Norsemen who really made Dublin the capital city of Ireland. The Norse element remained absolutely distinct not only in Dublin but also in the other cities in which they had settled, right down to the time of the English invasion in the 12th century. Frequent mention is made of them in the records of the great towns, and they often both claimed and received privileges quite different from those accorded to the native Irish or to the English settlers. They were known to the latter as Ostmen or Easterlings, a term which in this connection seems to have ousted the earlier Norvagiensis or les Norreys, les Norwegies. The term Austmen doubtless represents Old Norse Austmaður, a man dwelling to the east. Exactly how or where it first came to be applied to Norsemen it is difficult to say. The word has left its mark in Oxmanstown, earlier Ostmanstown, the district of the city of Dublin assigned to the Ostmen by the English invaders. Learning and religion in Ireland suffered grievously from Norse attack, but not so sorely as in England. There was never a time when so dark a picture could have been drawn of Irish learning as Alfred gives of the state of English learning when he translated the Pastoral Care, and when once the Vikings began to form settlements they were themselves strongly affected by the wealth of literary and artistic skill with which they found themselves brought into contact. The question of Irish influence on Norse mythology and literature is a much vexed one. At present we are suffering from a reaction against exaggerated claims made on its behalf some 30 years ago, but while refusing to accept the view that Norse legends, divine and heroic alike, are based on a wholesale refashioning and recreating of stories from Celtic saga lore, it would be idle to deny that the contact between the two nations must have been fertile of result and that Norse literature in form, style and subject matter alike bears many marks of Gaelic influence. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of the Vikings by Alan Mawer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kevin Johnson. Chapter 11. Scandinavian Influence in England. Of the districts occupied by Scandinavian settlers in England, the ones which show their presence most strongly are Cumberland, Westmorland, North Lancashire and Yorkshire in the Old Kingdom of Northumbria and the district of the Five Boroughs in the Midlands. East Anglia was not so deeply affected by the Danish occupation. Before dealing with one of the chief sources of our knowledge of the presence of Norse and Danish settlers in various parts of England, viz. The evidence derived from place nomenclature, a few words must be said as to the chief Scandinavian elements which can be recognised in English place names. Of elements other than personal names, the commonest are as follows, several of them being used as independent words to this day in English dialects, which have been affected by Scandinavian influence. Beck, Old Norse bekkr, brook, small stream of water. Biggin (g ended bracket), Old Norse bygging, building. By, Old Norse bor, Danish, Swedish by, town or village. This word indicates a Danish rather than a Norse settlement. Carr, kur, Old Norse kjar, kjur, brushwood, especially on swampy ground. Dale, Old Norse dalr, valley. Etymologically, this word might be of native English origin, but its distribution points to Norse influence. Fell, Old Norse fjalla, mountains. Force, Old Norse fors, waterfall. Forth, Old Norse fjorðr, fjord. English ford and Scandinavian forth often interchange in the old documents. Garth, Old Norse garðr, enclosure, the Scandinavian equivalent of English yard. Gill, Old Norse gil, deep narrow glen with the stream at the bottom. Holm, Old Norse holmr, small island, especially in a bay, creek or river. In England its meaning was further developed and it often means low-lying level ground on the borders of a river or stream, now often concealed in the suffix ham. Keld, Old Norse kelda, well, spring. Lund, lound, Old Norse lundr, grove, now often corrupted to land in English place names. Mire, Old Norse myr, moor, bog, swamp. Raise, Old Norse hreisi, cairn. Scale, Old Norse skatli, house. This word is Norse rather than Danish. Skar, skir, skeri, Old Norse sker, isolated rock in the sea. Scout, Old Norse skuti, cave formed by jutting rocks. Skaug, skow, Old Norse skogar, wood. Slack, Old Norse slaki, slope on a mountain edge, often used in English place names of a hollow or boggy place. Tarn, Old Norse tjorn, small lake. Thorpe, Old Norse thorp, hamlet, village. This word is also found in Old English and in some place names is undoubtedly of native origin, but its general distribution points fairly conclusively to Norse influence. Thwaite, Old Norse thveit, parcel of land, paddock. Toft, Old Norse topt, piece of ground, mesuage, homestead. With, Old Norse vithur, a wood. Wath, Old Norse voth, a ford. Place names with the prefix Norman mark the settlement not of Normans but of Norsemen (or Northmen as the English called them), as in Normanton and Normanby, while the settlement of Danes is marked by the prefix Dena or Den, as in Denaby and Denby. This latter prefix, however, has other sources as well. Scandinavian personal names are very common in place names, but their presence can as a rule only be detected with any degree of certainty by reference to the forms found in early documents. Among the more easily recognised are Grimr as Grimsarg (Lanks), and Grimsby (Links), Gunnar as in Gunnarside (Yorks), Ketil as in Kettlewell (Yorks), Clacker as in Claxton (North), Ormr as in Ormskirk (Lanks). Others to be found by reference to earlier forms are Frani as in Frainsfeld = Fransfield, knots, Gammal as in Gamelstun = Gamston, knots, Gunulfr as in Gunulveston = Gonalston, knots, Knútur as in Knútstone = Knutston, Northants, Leifr as in Levisby equals Laesaby, links, Sumarlithi as in Sumarlidebi, equals Somerby, links, Skuli as in Skuletuna, equals Skalton, North, Toli as in Tolisland, equals Tosland, Hunts, Vikingur as in Wichingestone, equals Wigston, lace, Ulver as in Ulvesby, equals Ulseby, links, Examining the distribution of Scandinavian place names, determined by the above tests, and others which can be applied with great accuracy if we study not the modern but the old forms of the place names, we find that the place nomenclature of Cumberland and Westmorland is almost entirely either Scandinavian or Celtic. Indeed, it would seem that the Anglian settlement had hardly affected these districts at all, and it was reserved for the Scandinavian settlers to Teutonise them. The same is true of Furness and Lancashire, north of the Ribble, whose old names Sturkaland and Agmunderness are of Norse origin, but south of that river there is a great diminution of Norse place names, except along the coast and a little way inland, where we have several bys and dales. In Cheshire the evidence of Scandinavian settlement is confined almost entirely to the Wirral, but there the large number of bys and place names like Thingwall point to a strong Viking colony, and the distribution of place names in South Lancashire and Cheshire bears witness to active intercourse between the settlers in Ireland and England. On the other side of the Pennine chain, though Northumberland was several times ravaged by the Norsemen and was probably well populated at least in the fertile river valleys, there is practically no evidence of their presence to be found in place names. There are several Biggins, Carrs and Holmes, a few Tofts and Dales, but these are common dialect words and usually found in uncompounded forms. They are practically never found in names of towns or villages, and may well have been introduced from districts further south. In the extreme west and southwest of the county there are fells and dales, but these are on the borders of Cumberland, Westmorland and Durham. The small streams are burns and not becks, the Wansbeck being a corruption of an earlier Wanesbeik. When we cross into County Durham, the tributaries of the Weir vary between burn and beck, but by the time we reach the Tees these have all become becks. Beechburn Beck, a tributary of the Weir, shows how a Scandinavian term could be attached to an English name when its own meaning was neglected or forgotten. Other Scandinavian names are common, but as in Northumberland they belong to the dialect generally and are seldom found in names of towns or villages. Viking settlers must have been few in number and widely scattered throughout these two counties. One great exception must be named among the towns, viz. Durham itself. The city was named Dunholmur, the hill island, by the Vikings, and its present name is only the Norman corruption of that form. South of the Tees we find ourselves in a district whose place names are to a very large extent Scandinavian, and Norse settlements are thickly and evenly distributed from the North Sea to the Pennine chain. Passing from Northumbria to the Danelagh, Lincolnshire is perhaps more purely Scandinavian in its place names than any other English county. In Derbyshire Viking influence is not so strong, but the county was probably very thinly inhabited at least in the north and west, and did not offer attractive settling ground. Derby itself was rechristened by the Northmen, its earlier name being Northwearthig. The rich fields and pastures of Leicestershire attracted a great many settlers, and Nottinghamshire is also strongly Scandinavian. Rutland and Northamptonshire are strongly Danish, except that there is some shading off towards the southwest corner of the latter county. In the country bordering the Danelagh On the south and west, Staffordshire has a few Scandinavian place names on its Derbyshire and Leicestershire borders, while Warwickshire has several on its Leicestershire and Northamptonshire borders. In East Anglia, Danish settlements must have been numerous in the north and east, especially towards the coast, but their presence is less strongly marked in the southwest portion of the county. In Suffolk they are confined still more definitely to the coast districts, and the Danes do not seem to have settled in the south of the county at all. 3 Kirbies near the Essex coast mark settlements in that county. Of the other border counties, Huntingdonshire, Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire show only the slightest traces of Scandinavian influence in their place nomenclature, though we know from other evidence that there must have been many Danish settlers in these counties. Closely allied to the evidence of place names is that of dialect. A very large number of words definitely of Scandinavian origin are found in the dialects of North East and North West England, in the North Midlands and East Anglia, but they do not furnish so sensitive a test as do place names for the extent of the Scandinavian settlements, and they need not be discussed here. More interesting as evidence of the deep influence of the Viking settlers on our language is the large number of Scandinavian loanwords which have become part of our standard speech, many of them being words essential to our everyday talk. To Scandinavian influence we owe the pronouns they, them and their, the adjectives same and both, the fro in to and fro, and possibly the auxiliary are and the preposition till. These last are found in the Northumbrian dialect of Old English, but their widespread use is probably due to Scandinavian influence. In addition to these we may note the following: verbs bait, bask, batten, call, cast, dawn, droop, drown, gain, gabble, ransack, scare, scour, scrape, skim, skip, squeal, stint, take. Nouns: anger, billow, boon, dusk, fellow, gate, grime, haven, husband, husk, husting, skull, scurf, skill, skin, skirt, sky, window. Adjectives: awkward, ill, odd, rotten, scant, sly, ugly, weak, and a good many words in which Scandinavian forms have replaced the cognate English ones, e.g. aloft, athwart, awe, birth, egg, get, gift, give, guest, raid, sister, swain, Thursday. These words are for the most part of the very stuff and substance of our language, giving vivid expression to clear-cut ideas, and though numerically they are outnumbered by the loan words from French, they are in themselves more essential to our speech than the rich vocabulary derived from that language. For the extent and character of the Viking settlements in England we have however a far more delicate and accurate index than that to be found in the evidence of place names and dialects. When we study the pages of Domesday, the great record of English social organisation in the 11th century, we find that in the counties which came under Viking influence there are many details of land division, tenure, assessment and social organisation generally, wherein these counties differ from the rest of England, and some of these differences can still be traced. The ridings of Yorkshire and the Lindsey division of Lincolnshire were originally Thrithings (Old Norse Þrithjungur, a third part), the initial th being later absorbed by the final consonant of the preceding east, west, north and south (in links). The chief tests of Scandinavian influence drawn from Domesday and allied sources are however as follows. 1. The use of the Danish wapentake as the chief division of the county in contrast to the English hundred. This is found in Lincolnshire, Derbyshire (with one exception on its southern border), Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, Rutland, and one district of Northamptonshire, now included in Rutland. We have wapentakes in Yorkshire, except in certain districts along the sea coast, while in Lancashire the term was applied to the court of the hundred or shire long after the conquest. There is some evidence also for the belief that the use of the hundred (or wapentake) as an administrative unit is in itself due to Scandinavian influence. The proportion of names of hundreds (or wapentakes) which are definitely of Danish origin is very high, and, unless we assume wholesale renaming, this points to their having been first named at a period subsequent to the Danish conquest. 2. The assessment by carucates in multiples and submultiples of 12 is characteristic of the Danelagh as opposed to that by hides arranged on a decimal system in the strictly English districts. This is found in Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire and Rutland. With the exception of the above mentioned district, there are traces of a duodecimal assessment in the 2 north east hundreds of Northamptonshire, while in Lancashire a hydal assessment has been superimposed upon an original carucal one. Carucal assessment is found also in Yorkshire, Norfolk and Suffolk. 3. In Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Yorkshire we have traces of the use of the Danish long hundred = 120, e.g. the fine for breaking the king's peace is £8, i.e. 120 ores of 16 pence. Using the various tests we find that the Scandinavian kingdom of Northumbria was considerably smaller than the earlier realm of that name, Northumberland and Durham being but sparsely settled, while South Lancashire and Cheshire were occupied chiefly along the coast. The kingdom would seem to fall into two isolated halves, Cumberland and Westmorland and North Lancashire in the northwest and Yorkshire in the southeast. The district of the 5 boroughs covered Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire (Lincoln and Stamford), Leicestershire and probably the whole of Rutland (Stamford). The case of Northamptonshire is difficult. The carucal assessment fails except in the extreme northeast of the county, but Danish place nomenclature is strongly evident, though it shades off somewhat towards the southwest. It resembles Danish East Anglia rather than the district of the 5 boroughs, and it is possible that the boundary of Guthrum's East Anglian kingdom, which is only carried as far as Stony Stratford in the peace of Alfred and Guthrum, really ran along Watling Street for a few miles, giving 2/3 of that county to the East Anglian realm. Northumbria was governed by a succession of kings. The 5 boroughs formed a loose confederation, and there can be no question that the districts which obeyed the boroughs of Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, Lincoln (and Stamford) and Northampton form the modern counties named from these towns. It is also to Danish influence, direct or indirect, that we owe the similar organisation of the counties of Huntingdonshire, Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire in the old East Anglian kingdom. Each of these counties had a jarl or earl whose headquarters were at the borough. He summoned the here, whether for political or military purposes, and when these counties passed once more under English rule he fulfilled the functions of the older ealdorman. In East Anglia, apart from place names and carucal assessment in Norfolk and Suffolk, we are left with the boundaries of Guthrum's kingdom and with various miscellaneous evidence for estimating the extent of Scandinavian influence. There is a curious hundredus dacorum in Hertfordshire, whilst the Historia Eliensis and other documents tend to show the presence of a strong Danish element in the population and social organisation of the districts around Cambridge. The kingship of East Anglia came to an end early in the 10th century, and it is probable that its organisation was then changed to one resembling that of the five boroughs, viz. A number of districts grouped around central boroughs, which afterwards became counties, except in the older division of Norfolk and Suffolk. A careful study of Domesday and other authorities reveals many other features of interest in our social system which were due to Viking influence. Certain types of manorial structure are specially common in the Danelagh. Manor and vill are by no means identical, indeed several manors are included under one vill. Very frequent is the type which consists in a central manor with sokeland appurtenant. In the Danelagh there was a large number of small freeholders, and the free peasant class was much more numerous in the Anglo-Saxon England. These districts stand in clear contrast to the strongly manorialised southern counties, and they were not feudalised to any appreciable extent before the Norman conquest. When that system was imposed, we often find single knights' fees having to be taken over by entire communities of sokemen. The holds of Northumbria, who rank next after the earls, and the drengs of Cumberland, Westmorland, Lancashire, Northumberland and Durham are also of Scandinavian origin. The dreng was a free servant of the king endowed with lands, and the name still survives in the Yorkshire place name Dringhouses. The legal instinct was strong in the Scandinavian mind, and English law bears deep marks of its influence. The very word law itself is of Scandinavian origin and has replaced the English doom. The chief judicial authority in Lincoln, Stamford, Cambridge, Chester and York was in the hands of 12 lagmen or judices. These lawmen, though they had judicial authority, were not chosen by the king or by popular election. Their position was hereditary. Of special interest are the 12 senior thanes of Aethelred's laws for the 5 boroughs enacted at Wantage in 997. They have to come forward in the court of every wapentake and to swear that they will not accuse wrongly any innocent man or conceal any guilty one. The exact force of this enactment has been a matter of dispute, whether the thanes simply bore witness to the personal status of the accused, thus enabling the court to determine the ordeal through which he should be put, or whether we have an anticipation of the system of presentment by jury. Whatever may be the exact truth, there can be little doubt, says Dr. Vinogradov, that such a custom prepared the way for the indictment jury of the 12th century. The same author attributes to Danish influence a new conception of crime. It is no longer merely a breach of the peace or the result of a feud to be settled by monetary compensation. It is a breach of that conception of honour which binds together military societies. The criminal is now branded as nithing, a man unworthy of comradeship with his fellow warriors. Unfortunately, it is only within the last few years that the question of Danish influence on our social, political and legal systems has been treated at all seriously, and much work still remains to be done. But we can already see that the Danes affected English life far more deeply than a superficial glance might suggest. Doubtless the Danish invasion struck a heavy blow at learning and literature, a blow from the effects of which not even the heroic activities of an Alfred could save them. But there can be no question that in the development of town life, in the promotion of trade, in the improvement of organisation and administration, in the modification of legal procedure, the invaders conferred great benefits on the country as a whole. End of chapter 11.